from now on, with the emergence of the pliage, i.e. the folding method, which Hantai adopted in 1960, or a little bit earlier, as you will see in a minute, basically the basic rules or the fundamental kind of, application of paint didn't change a lot. There are tremendous changes. But between 1960 and 1982, for 22 years, he did work with folding, the method of folding, as he called it, in 1967 or after 1967. And this method, this is one of the first paintings from the first series of works called Mural. Mural, i.e. the cloaks of the Virgin, Marian paintings. Again, after Écriture Rose, pink writing, and after Tu Galla Placidia, when he was thinking about private and collective memory, about the Judeo-Christian Western world, painting, representation, and the sacred. This idea that painting has something to do with the sacred remained with him, because he created a series of canvases named Marian paintings and making them to refer to the cloak of the Virgin, which, there is no Virgin there, just the cloak. And the cloak is done on the floor. What he did using oil paint, he took the kind of rectangular canvas, made different sort of folds, creases, and then covered it with, in this case, yellow gold, thick oil paint. Then, when the paint was dry, he unfolded it. He had to a little bit re-wet. With the unfolding, those parts, what you see as white, those are the unpainted, reserved, blank areas, right? Which became visible with the smoothing out of the creases and the folds, creating this strange, blinding, kind of fragmented, abstract pattern among the raw canvas, the white, or pre-painted white, and the actual color, which was painted board to board on the crease surface. Let's see another one, because you will see that this is a blue one. Blue, which is quite adequate, because usually the cloak of the Virgin in Christian religious painting used to be, ultramarine lapis lazuli, the ultimate color, the most expensive color, right? It was more expensive than anything else. We do know from Cimabue and Giotto that, whenever they got a commission from a church, there was always a kind of closure in the contract that this is the amount of money, what they are willing to pay for the lapis lazuli paint, the ultramarine paint. So they have to kind of calculate the largeness of that cloak on the Virgin according to the preset kind of, conditions and budget and resources. Again, you can see the same, and you can see that there is also a black, a kind of darker bluish. Very often these are not one color, but what he did after creasing, making these creases on the canvas, kind of wetting it, and applying the blue paint, he did apply blue or darker, almost blackish blue. There is different colors did emerge, dried, and then smoothed out. He could not fully smooth. Let's go to the next one. Let's go to one more. Yeah, he couldn't fully smooth. In this case, he basically left it covered. It's almost like a monochromatic painting. You do see the creases. You do see the textural effect. But you also see that it's very thick. See these? These are belonging to the series C. Within these Marian paintings, there were 4 series, A, B, C, D. Some of these are belonging to the C. You see that almost incrustation, like soil, dry soil. This is very, very deep valleys. You see that? Of the dirty kind of, ground of the canvas. And then reds and greens, different colors are covering it. The first series, the Mural or Marian paintings, which included A, B, C, D series called The Cloaks of the Virgin, are traditionally considered as the first folded paintings in the Oeuvres 1960. But if we go back to, and this is it. This is a very tiny work. Very, very tiny, miniature scale work. And what you are looking at is a folded canvas, painted, overpainted with oil, looking almost like a mummy, right? A shroud covering a dead body. Also, it's on the horizontal. And this was created in 1950-51. Between 1950 and 52, among those many and kind of quite diverse experimentations, what we witnessed or traced, right, after his arrival to Paris in 1948 until the early 50s, until when he became a member of the Surrealist group. Pliage, folding of the canvas, the folding and then overpainting of the canvas was one among many other different material experimentations. So the pliage was not really introduced into the work anew from scratch in 1960. Rather, when after écriture rose, after this serious, complex anamnesis and self-analysis, the reflection, the process of year-long reflection, what the production of the écriture rose painting, the pink writing painting entailed, he probably started to look back and revise and return and rework already existing methodologies, paint applications. And then he didn't invent, but rather return to the idea of the folded canvas. Let's go a little bit ahead. So this is the first series, yeah, next one. And the second series is very interesting. Not large, you saw the Marian paintings are large paintings. And for the most, they have one color. That is, they do play with the monochrome painting. You do know the story of the monochrome. The monochrome started in 1921 in Russia, still Russia, not yet the Soviet Union, in the hands of Alexander Rodchenko, who painted a pure yellow, a pure blue, and a pure red painting. Hantai, with the pliage, not only went to an folkloric, artisanal, like batik, right? We don't make paintings using techniques like batik. It's a serious kind of, renewal of Western abstract painting via an utterly non-artistic, but a rather craft-like methodology. But not only that, he also married or coupled this craft-like artisanal material application with one of the most privileged modernist pictorial kind of device, which was the monochrome. But not fully monochrome, because you saw that there were different colors. The next series, Catamaran, as it is called, 1963-64, kind of brought back color contrasts. Although, as you see in the Marians, there were colors, but they were very close to each other. Color was not used to create contrast, to create a variety within the color application. With the Catamaran, the second series, he brought back the contrasted color application. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, no, actually, go back, sorry, yeah. Another thing which emerged, as you saw, the Marian paintings were all edge-to-edge, all over, board-to-board paintings. There were no, the colored, folded areas did not behave as if they would be a figure on a ground. They did not function or register as a motif. With the Catamaran, not only he brought back the color contrast, not only he brought back the smaller scale, but also he left the edges, right? The white gesso, the white oil paint covered ground color intact, only folded and creased the middle of the small-scale rectangular canvas. If you go to the next one, which actually has two colors, because it has black too, a blackish, brownish kind of dirt color, you see again that he resumed the folded and color thing as a figure on a ground. The series Catamaran, that is C-A-T-A-M-U-R-O-N, it's called after Catamaran because they look a little bit like doors, don't they? They look like openings, the color area, a rectangular shape within another, a fairly rectangular shape within another rectangular, like a door opening in a wall, right? They were inspired by the experience which he had in Normandy during a summer when he vacationed in a house, in a bed and breakfast or a little gîte in Normandy in France. And the house was called Les Catamarans, which gave the title of the series. And during this summer with his family in this house in Normandy called Catamaran, the title of the house, he saw a door with a little kind of colored, a brown door with a blue rectangular kind of handkerchief-like thing attached to the door. Brown door with a blue kind of rectangle. This idea of painting within the painting, repeating the rectangular roughly, right? And introducing color contrast kind of reflected in this. Let's go to the next one. Yeah. We keep the edges, we keep the folded area as if it would be a figure in the ground, but in the third series, which is called Pans, which is really interesting, and if I say it in French, it's a little bit like sex prime, which is sex first, or sex and something primal, but it also means that something sex prime, that is, it explains itself, it explicates itself, right? So there is a linguistic pun there. Here in puns too, because puns, the French title, I'm using the French titles because it is a linguistic pun, it resists linguistic translation, of course. So puns with an A, P-A-N-S-E, which means belly. Right? Something what we stuff, especially during Christmas, right? Belly. But if I say it in French, pense also means to think, of course. Penser is to think. Can we think with our bellies? What's the relationship between, you know, intellectual and cognitive functions and our bodies? How do we negotiate, right, our corporeal existence or being with things which function at the level of, you know, cognitive function and language? So it's a linguistic pun, and they look a little bit like puns. They look like a little bit like sausages, head cheeses. He called it puns, but he also gave an alternative title to a series of small paintings, which was maman, maman, that is mum, mum, exclamation marks, la saucisson, that is the sausage. And you might be asking, okay, so what does this have to do with mother, mother, and the sausage? Simon Hantai grew up and was born in Bia, in a small village not very far from Budapest. And he grew up in a house, and there was an attic. And in Hungarian peasant houses, in the attic, when one maybe wandered up there a few times, you could actually see sausages and head cheeses hanging, right? The corporeal, the bodily, something what we eat and then it ends up in our palms, that is in our bodies, this almost vulgar and also somewhat comic, it's a funny reference, is very much present in this work. Puns, let's go to the next one. Always multicolored, quite beautiful, highly saturated colors, comic little shapes, sometimes coming to the edges, right? Kind of starting to move away from the otherwise quite hierarchic, centralized composition of both Katamuran and most of these. Let's go to the next one. When you see a bunch of them, so you can see them in all their variety. There's something, the caption is missing here, but you can see how do they move, sometimes breaking through the edges of the paint. They all look like cells, right? You can think about sausages and head cheeses since I, you know, explained the analogy and the second subtitle, Maman, Maman, la saucisse. But you can also think about cells or vegetal creatures, crystals. Very interesting that he folds, right? But still, the biomorphic imagination of the surrealist period reemerges or reappears in a different sort of configuration. Let's go to this series was created between 60, next. Yeah. This series was, he finished this in 1965. And in 1965, 1966, he stopped painting for a short period of time. During that time, he moved to Mön. We started with Mön, with the little hamlet outside of Paris when he lived in a house, and he painted between 66 and 82. Leaving Paris, moving out from Paris in 1966, at a time when, you know, Fifth Republic, de Gaulle came back, the Paris Biennale, kind of initiated by André Malraux in 1959, started. Paris was working with all its might and force to put itself back again to the map of Western art. Paris wanted quite badly, and with the Fifth Republic's kind of new cultural policy, there was a new, if you like, a quite animated cultural period, 66. This is the moment when Hantai chose to leave, right? Which is a really interesting thing, really kind of not caring about the new institutional network, a new generation of artists, Daniel Buren, Pierre Bourraillot, artists who later became very, very well known and who visited him in his Parisian studio. His moving away to Mön was a very radical rupture and discontinuity in his life. He broke away from these young painters who visited him, frequented him, and he broke away with the whole kind of Parisian art, and he could see exhibitions. It was really a kind of voluntary exile, not to be connected, not to be part of whatever is happening in Paris. And in '66, after they moved to Münster, he stopped painting for, as I said, for a brief period of time, and then started with a new series. And let's go to the new series, because the new series, let's go a little bit ahead. Yeah. You can see him in the studio in Münster, in the house, surrounded by these new canvases, the new canvases which are called Mün, M-E-U-N, named after the house where he moved in 1966. These canvases were created between 1966 and '68. And if we go ahead a little bit, you will see that this multicolored, somewhat biomorphic, right, strange cellular vegetal imagery, which we saw in Pons, is still there. But he suddenly starts to kind of break the shapes to the edge, only folds the canvas in the middle, and here, let's go to the next one, right, reassumes the single color, or one color with different tonalities. Let's go to the next one. And then kind of makes the folds larger and larger. When you see larger white areas, that means that, you know, larger and larger folds and knots were created. That is smaller the actual surface which was left there to paint, board to board with a brush, usually on the floor. You know, he was folding it and knotting it on the floor. These colored surfaces became smaller and smaller. Let's go back to the text. I have a slide with text. Yeah. In 1967, in the summer of 1967, he did have a retrospective exhibition at the Galerie Jean Fournier. Galerie Jean Fournier, which used to be called Galerie Kléber, the sex prime exhibition with the wide calligraphic canvases, the Souvenir de in '56, the Souvenir de l'Avenir with the predominantly black and white, very minimalistic sign paintings in '57 took place in that gallery. The Galerie Kléber was directed, the director of the gallery was Jean Fournier. As soon as he kind of opened his own gallery in Paris, which is still around, Simon Hantai was one of the first artists who became associated with Jean Fournier's gallery. Others were included were Shirley Jaffe, Joan Mitchell, and Sam Francis. A very heavy American presence. Sam Francis was introduced to Fournier by Hantai in 1956, and it was predominantly abstract, French and American abstract painters. Okay, so at this exhibition he published this text, and the text states that his painting is about retinal silences. Retinal silence, which is really interesting because there is no such thing as retinal silence when it's about painting. If something is on that canvas, then it's not a silent canvas. And especially his canvases, which are so chromatically motivated, so decorative, so strong, right? It's not a very silence-driven kind of, you know, they're not silent as paintings. But then he published, these are the titles. He kind of proposes reference points for the first 4 series. This is Manteau de la Vierge, the Cloaks of the Virgin, the Mariam paintings we started with, right, between '60 and '62. The second was Les Catamurons, which he titled The Door, which he believes that still a continuation of the Mariam paintings. Then, still a continuation of the Mariam paintings. The first series is Maman, Saucisse, right? The head cheeses, Pons, otherwise, I know it's confusing, 64, 65. And then, this is when it gets interesting, he says that continuation or extension or not, Mün, 1967. So, and then this is what it's important, he says, the pliage comme méthode, folding as a method. What does a method mean? Why not a technique? If one has a method, like psychoanalysis is a method according to Sigmund Freud. If one practices a method, that means that there is no such thing that one can ever master a method. Right? A method is something which is a continuous, extended, for forever extended, trial and failure thing. The method is something which is a practice, a continuous practice. A technique is a skill which one can learn, master, and then become perfect at it. Saying that the pliage is a method and not a technique means that there is a resistance, right? A refusal to call it a technique that is something which can be mastered and perfected. Method means that one just tries and tries and tries, and there is no good or better way, that painting becomes a continuously extended practice of experimentation via folding and painting. This is what it means. So it becomes a kind of systematic, it's a program, right? This is what I do. This is my pictorial method. So let's see that what happens after 67 when with Mön moving out to Paris, creating a new series which is not closely related or not directly coming out or emerges from the earlier ones. What did change? Here there are the canvases. This is the installation shots are all from the 1998 retrospective exhibition which took place in Münster in Germany, which was one of the fullest kind of, overview of Hantai's pliage until probably the retrospective in Paris, which is just about to open, not about in 4 months. You can see these things. Although you can think about maybe biomorphic shapes still if you feel so inclined, but it becomes very clear that he breaks away from the biomorphic. There are only one color, blues and blacks. The monochrome comes back. Let's go back one. This is perfect. We went, I think, ahead, but it doesn't matter. Look at that. This painting is flat, no textural effect, no naturalistic connotations and references, no biomorphism. You don't know where is the center and there is a decentering. The all over comes back. The shapes start to crawl all over. You do see that there is, indeed, stylistically speaking, a very radical change, because the Marian paintings, Pans and Catamaran were playing with a somewhat kind of, naturalistic effect of paint and texture and canvas. This naturalistic effect, which was inscribed or contained by the texture, is rejected here. Monochrome, flat, decorative, abstract. That's one thing what's happening. The second is, look at the white. And now let's go back to the installation shot. Look at that. The white becomes more and more important. And remember the white in Cézanne? And now we can go a little bit ahead to the Matisse. Yeah, to the Matisse, yeah, this is it. This is a large Matisse, a gorgeous Matisse, which is in the National Gallery in the East Wing in Washington, D.C. This is a Matisse découpage, a cutout. When he cut, painted papers with gouache and then cut them in the air. And then he spaced them all around. Of course, you can argue that there is a little kind of similarity. You can see the Möns playing with the center and then kind of, spreading all over the canvas. You can recognize these shapes in relation to Möns. But what I would like to, the point I would like to make here is not a formal analogy. It's not a morphological similarity between these shapes and Hantai's Möns. What I would like you to see or recognize is that just as for Matisse, everything you see, what you see is a decorative, large, painted collage, huge, giant one. Everything you see appears to be in vibration, in movement, it's dynamic, it's decorative. Why do you see colors such way? Why colors are so bright? Because everything works via the white. Right? He plays with the white. He uses of the white paper in a way that the colors are colors because the white, the interstitial white spaces, right, create this extremely strong, vibrant chromatic effect. If the base would not be white, if these things would be closer to each other, not spaced by the ground, the illuminated white ground, the whole thing would be dirty looking, right? Matisse realizes that painting the paper, cutting the paper, and then positioning the paper. It's all about spacing. How to space the color against the white. Right? Color and white and spacing. Let's go ahead. This is a poster of Hantai's retrospective exhibition at the Fondation Maecht, which was a quite recently funded private foundation. Some of you probably know it, in the south of France. It's very beautiful. It's a very beautiful kind of location. The Fondation Maecht, who gave out a Grand Prix, a major prize for contemporary artists in France. Hantai became the first laureate of the Grand Prix of the Fondation Maecht. And then in 1969, he had a solo exhibition there. you do realize that this idea of spacing color and white against each other, creating this dynamic form, this had to do with Matisse. And of course, when he received the Grand Prix, when he was working on his retrospective exhibition, that was the first time in his life when he actually could see Matisse. He could see Matisse's large cutout, which were in the south, in the Musée Matisse in Nice. And he also, of course, visited, and if we go a little bit ahead, let's go ahead. He also visited the Dominican chapel, the Chapelle du Rosaire in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, the chapel which Matisse decorated. These are his drawings. And he also did the stained glass windows. And where everything is about white and color, illumination and vibration, the interaction between things which are there in the colored glass, and the interaction between the light which enters through the glass. So Matisse's kind of spacing and interest in how to dynamize things, whether on a flat paper or in space between color and light, becomes the single most important inspiration. And the third addition in the major references, Cézanne, Pollock, and then Matisse in the late 1960s. And this is when things start to change. So let's go back a little bit and run through two series. This is a kind of transitional work. After Mön, the next series is called Etude. Etude, like a musical etude, when one plays small kind of exercises. And what happens, let's go to the next one. You see that the shapes are kind of, we are getting away with the bodily, everything which could be still seen as something, you know, flower-like or biomorphic. And there's an all-over kind of folding and creasing of the canvas. Let's go to the next one. The creases are becoming smaller and smaller. He makes these irregular small knots all over the place. Sometimes, you know, around the corners, it becomes an irregular surface saturated by color, made dynamic by the randomly folded, knotted colors. Let's go to the next one. And this is how these paintings look like in the studio, on the floor and in the wall. And when I talk about, you know, how the white and the color, the fragmented forms, the painted and the unpainted, creates this thoroughly dynamic, monumental interaction, and the space as it appears on the wall, right? You can see it right there. If you go to the next one, you will also see the invitation. This is the invitation for their exhibition, which again, of course, like every exhibition of a solo show by Hantai took place at Fournier, Jean Fournier. And the show itself was dedicated to Pierre Reverdy, the great poet who was associated with Breton, but also was one of the first kind of person in 1917 who wrote about the collage and wrote a very beautiful text, published a text about the collage. Okay, let's go to the next one, when you can see him. Again, you see that scene s'exprime, when he was crouching or squatting, right? Squatting among the canvases. The photographs, when he is overwhelmed or enveloped, right? In a quite powerful way by the paintings, that he inhabits a space which is fully structured by the paintings. This becomes a part of his iconography, right? He loved to publish pictures of himself surrounded by the works, always many works. There was always an idea of accumulation and multitude. Just as when you look at the paintings, these are the same paintings I showed you in color, of course. This is a photograph by Edouard Boubat, who was a very well-known, famous French photographer who was a neighbor of Hantai in Mön. It's a little bit like, you know, Jackson Pollock and Hans Namuth in the Springs in East Hampton. Hans Namuth, who took the photograph I showed about Pollock, that was taken by Namuth, who was, you know, Pollock's next door neighbor in Long Island. Okay, let's go to the next one. Because, you know, Etude was still about white is the ground color and one color applied. He became interested in bringing back the polychrome. Not one color, not the one single color applied, but the many color applied. But interestingly, he decided to call the next series, created in 1973, 1974, which are flatter than his painting ever been, because he started to employ acrylic paint. He called these blanc, that is either white or empty. Again, we can play, you know, in French, blanc can be white and empty. Why is this white? You need to ask at this point. You see many colors. Until the last time you saw so many colors within one single square of a canvas was in the mid-1950s surrealist paintings, when you really did have a cavalcade of chroma. So what's happening? Why blanc? Why white? Because as I said with Cézanne and Matisse, what is interesting here is not what is painted, which is indeed pure, untainted, beautiful colors, fragmented colors, which he applied with a brush. After folding the canvas, these small surface areas were on top. He painted with these different colors. When they were dried, he smoothed it. He could smooth it because there were more and more acrylics, so the painting could be smoothed and flattened almost to the fullest. And then the white took over. Why is white? Why is blanc or empty? Because what is important is not what is painted, but what is unpainted. Because what you see as color, what is painted, is only brought into the visible, why the contrasted, the nothing, the empty, the reserve area. The white grants, the nothing, the unpainted, activates everything, which creates the shape you see. This is working via negativa. This is working through the empty canvases in Cézanne. This is working through the white in Matisse. This is a very importantly kind of, historically conscious reworking of painting, which is not about adding color, creating color, but letting the reserve, the white, the empty, to create. Right? Let's go to the next one. Because you see that these are extremely enchanting. Again, the decorative, remember, I started to say that if there is one thing which connects the late 1940s and the 1970s is that they are deeply decorative. And if you go to the next one, you do realize that this is the installation shot, and then the next one, yes. This is 6 paintings which he put together in 1974. He decided to kind of undo the composition in 1998 December. But between 74 and 1998 December, these 6 paintings were on view in the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris, and they were called Mural. Because, of course, the idea of color, white, the decorative, and the saturation, the filling the space up with color, he needed scale to do that. You can't do that with small individual squares of painting. And this is again after seeing Matisse, after seeing Vence, the chapel in Vence, when he realized that to cover thoroughly and fully the walls with painting, this became a very important ambition for him, industrially scaled painting. Right? So this is both Etude and Blanc in the early 1970s are basically these are the mature pliage paintings when the Matisse effect, right, reaches a kind of important point and becomes a working principle for Hantai. And if you go to the next one, after this, yeah. The last series of pliage which he created, which consists of 2 series indeed, in the 70s, early 70s, and then in the 80s. These are the tabulas. You already saw this. This is 1974, acrylic, flat, 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 and looks like a tablecloth, right? It has a grid. He didn't even have to think about how to knot, because when you use a grid, the grid is an anti-compositional device. You don't have to compose. You just have to decide how large the small square should be, right? Until you decide the scale of the square, you just automatically, without thinking about it, really like a craftsperson who just paints in the pre-painted form, right? Painting is not a cognitive activity. Painting is not something highfalutin. Painting is something deeply anti-intellectual. We are sitting on the floor and knotting, making knots, and then even using maybe a broom. It doesn't matter how it is painted. It doesn't have to be well painted. It just has to be covered with paint. We cover it, and then we open it, and here it is. That's tabula. Let's go to the next one, because you see that the grid shape as a non-compositional device further simplifies the procedure, right, and the method of pliage. Different scales, different colors. This is blue. This is very blue. And if you go to the next one, you do see the cover of a retrospective exhibition he had in 1976, which did include the first series of tabulas. You see, this is how it looks before it is unfolded. Right? This is the face of the canvas. The back is full of knots, right? Little knots. Right? Then covered with paint, and then when it is opened, it looks like that. And let's go to the next one, because do you see this? This photograph was included along with the 2 previous ones into the 1976 retrospective exhibition catalogue of Hantai at the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris. He included this photograph. This is early 20s. This is his mother, before his mother would have given birth to Simon Hantai. And the mother is wearing a Rumburger apron, as it was called, Swabs, right? The Swabs, the German-speaking kind of, you know, peasants, especially in the Trans-Danubian era, did used to wear it as part of their folk kind of habit. And the Rumburger apron was folded, and then with a piece of wool rolled over, peasant ironing, right? It was a very special cotton velvet, which was usually indigo colored or black. And after washing it, and Hantai did participate, as he recalled in 1976, he participated in the ironing of his mother's Rumburger apron. While this cotton was still wet, they folded it into grid shape, and then using a wooden roll, the Hungarian name is mangorló, they rolled it over, folded again, rolled it over. They were rolling and folding in square shapes, creating this grid pattern. Here you see after it was unfolded, until it was almost like a mirror, so shiny, so smooth. And of course, the edges of the fold in the textile created the grid shape. You see, I started saying that he goes back to the Italian frescoes and then plays with Bonnard, contemporary Bonnard paintings. The trans-historical jumps, the references, right? The multitude of references. And also that painting always has to do with memory. He goes back to the pliage, which he already introduced in 1950, 10 years later, right? 1960. He says, okay, this is what I'm doing. In 1976, suddenly, out of nothing, after 16 years of practice, he brings this photograph, he publishes this photograph to say that it's even earlier than that. What I'm doing as a painting is a craft habit which I grew up with. Right? It's a very interesting proposition. All these propositions are always destabilizing the order of the pliage. He used to kind of bring newer and newer references to undo the folding, his method as a linear story, to complicate it, right? To propose different references, to rewrite basically the history of his own painting. Okay, let's go to the next one. And these are the tabulas which he created in the early 80s. In the 1970s, he stopped painting in the late 70s for a period of time. And between 80 and 82, relaunched a new series of tabulas, playing with the same grid shape. Let's go to the next one. Sometimes kind of, you know, pairing them with different colors, getting again away from the monochrome, bringing back, you know, different colors. Let's go to the next one. The contrast, you know, the catamaran shapes, the rectangular kind of basic shapes are returning. You do see the changes. All these changes are occurring within one very loosely defined method, what we call folding, and they create new and new variations or changes. And to see the very last series he did, let's go ahead. Yeah, here are a few ones. These are all 1980, 82. And in 1981, he had an exhibition. Let's go to the next one. And this is a bad quality photograph because the original is also quite bad quality. You see these canvases? These look like this is 1981, we are in Bordeaux. The idea that painting should be like curtains, like tablecloths, like stage sets almost, monumental, industrial scale, the giant. When paintings become space, when space is nothing, just color illuminated by the whites, right? In Bordeaux in 1981, when he had a solo exhibition, he actually made that. He created something which was, if you like, Matissian abstraction, French abstraction, inscribed into the Cézanne Matisse legacy of 20th century French art. On the other hand, this was monumental, industrially scaled craft enterprise. How to negotiate those two very different things I just said about this show, the two possibilities to think about it, is a very interesting question. Why am I showing this? Because a year after this exhibition in 1982, Hantai, after he represented France at the Venice Biennale, he stopped painting in the fall of 1982. And then if you go to the next one, which is called Laissez, there is leftovers, remainders. In the 1990s, he went back to those very large canvases you just saw, the monumental one, and he started to cut them up, like Matisse was cutting the paper, except that he was cutting in the garden of his house in Münster, and he cut those monumental squares up and re-stretched them one after the other. And sometimes you see that there must have been something else next to it, because where does that blue come from? It's really interesting to look at one of these, because if you spend more than 2.5 minutes with them, you will realize that there is something monumental about them, although they are this scale or even smaller. But somehow they do remember, right, the fact that they were part of a larger monumental structure. How is that possible? How can a fragment, an almost generic-looking rectangular folded painted fragment of a very large canvas, can remind you, can refer back to its origin? How can the matter remember that it belonged to somewhere else? Leftover, if you like, an artist in his 80s started to cut up the old canvases after a very long pause of not painting, not showing, not exhibiting, in full exile. So leftovers were to rewrite, to recut, to resize, to restretch, to rethink the oeuvre yet again. And the very last project is a book which, remember Écriture Rose when he was copying? Well, the idea of the copying, if you like, if you cut your own paintings up, that's copying too. You copy yourself, you appropriate yourself, right? You create a self-referential circuit, taking your own earlier work and making new work from your old one. In the late 1990s, Hantai started to have a correspondence, a handwritten manuscript correspondence with the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy. And in 2001, Galilée decided, the French publishing house decided to publish these letters. Jean-Luc Nancy's letters to Hantai and Hantai's letters to Jean-Luc Nancy. And the third philosopher, who was a very close friend of both Hantai and Jean-Luc Nancy, Jacques Derrida, decided to write a preface, a foreword to the book. Well, the book is really interesting because on one side you see the handwritten letter, on the other you see the printed letter. The book is among three people: Jacques Derrida, who was born in North Africa and was a North African Jew. There is Simon Hantai, who was born in Bia and was a Swab, a Hungarian Swab, whatever that means. These are complicated things. Who became a painter, a major painter in Paris. And there is Jean-Luc Nancy, who lives in Strasbourg and who is an Alsatian. That is, his identity, cultural and linguistic identity, is somewhere in between two languages and two cultures, German and French, right? It's an exchange among them. It's a document of friendship. But let's look at the next page. Because Hantai didn't just publish his personal correspondence with Jean-Luc Nancy and with the foreword or the preface by Jacques Derrida, but he also did illustrations to the book. And guess what? He took canvases. Right? Colored inks, very much as he did in 1958, during the advent of 1958, when he started to work on pink writing. And started to copy the works of Derrida and Nancy on top of each other, one after the other, with colored inks. And if you go to the next one, the previous one was about blinding. Copying, making a writing which is illegible. Writing becomes like painting. The handwritten sign becomes something visual, but not legible. It's not about the meaning of the words, but about the color of the words, the shapes of the words, right? It's an obstruction of handwriting. It's an obstruction of language. It's an obstruction of the orthographic gesture. And the close-up, this is how the close-up looks like. You can sometimes recognize half-word or words, but I find it is a kind of very moving end to finish with this, because we finish with not painting but writing, or we finish maybe with something which is visual, which negotiates words and images, color and white, and which is just as folding canvases on the floor, essentially motivated by a very humble gesture, right? Just to imitate, to copy, to use the words of others, just as folding, if we believe to the photograph of the mother, was nothing but a redoing, a copying of that gesture of ironing a Rumburger apron in the 1920s. Thank you very much for being here and for your patience. Thank you.